To understand the economics behind Pérez's IMF package and the Caracazo, we need to address one basic misunderstanding. Having natural resources is not what makes countries rich. Think, for example, of the big development successes after the Second World War. Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore. None of them have large natural resources. Actually, natural resources aren't good or bad for economic development, but they are intensifiers. They make countries with good economic institutions richer and countries with bad economic institutions poorer.
So it's really the economic institutions that matter, about how economic activity itself is organized and regulated. It matters both small and big.
And what crashed in the 80s wasn't only Venezuela's oil incomes, but with them Venezuela's entire economic development model.
To understand this, we need to look at developing countries' basic economic problem: how to industrialize in an already industrialized world.
Imagine a world of free trade, and you live in a country that so far exported mainly agricultural products. If you want to launch a startup producing bicycles, you have to compete with highly efficient industries that already exist in other countries. But you don't have the money or know-how to just stamp such a highly productive industry out of the ground. Developing industry needs a period of trial and error to develop the right production processes. And all of that costs a lot of money. And that's why practically no country industrialized just by private enterprise and with free trade. Almost invariably, the state needed to help industrialize the economy. In most of Latin America, the policy of choice to do that was import substitution industrialization, or short ISI. The idea basically was that the state blocks the import of bicycles so that you don't face the competition, but not of tires and bicycle frames. That way you can start your business and assemble and sell your bikes. At the same time, the state heavily invests in big infrastructure like roads so that people can actually use your bikes. Once that works, the state also blocks tires and frames, but not rubber, plastic, steel and aluminium alloys, and you or somebody else moves to producing these tires and frames as well. And thus you industrialize bit by substituting international imports with domestic industrialization. Hence, import substitution industrialization. Well, that's the theory. In practice, there are two main problems with this. The obvious one is, when exactly will you lower your tariff barriers again? Of course, the bike makers you protect are quite comfortable with the state protecting them. They don't want to compete with the international bike industry. So lowering these tariffs will make them very angry or even put them out of work. And because of that, it could be political suicide to lower the tariffs. And so, as a politician, you'd just not do it. The other problem is that you need to export something to get the dollars to import the stuff that you need.
Now, Venezuela has a lot of oil, so getting these dollars isn't really all that difficult for it. And think about this from the point of view of a politician in charge of the country. You could either remove these protections and reform the economy, which would in the short term maybe lead to some unemployment and probably not be very popular, or you could just keep things flowing as they are. And that was essentially the problem that developed in the 70s. Rather than reforming and diversifying the economy, politicians chose to do very little or nothing and watch the entire cycle become dependent on the one export product that Venezuela has: oil.
So the ISI model made Venezuela overly reliant of a steady stream of oil revenues to import stuff and prop up state-run companies, mainly the petrochemical, steel and aluminium industries. It's ISI that made governments the powerful manager of this economy. The abuse of this power in the military was partly behind the 1992 coup. But the main economic problem wasn't corruption itself, but ISI. It's that this model can't work with lower oil prices and thus fewer dollars. Governments couldn't uphold the subsidies for the entire economy that now had fewer dollars to import stuff. This meant fewer and more expensive inputs, which put pressures on domestic prices to go up. Also, as long as oil dollars flowed in, having many dollars and a good-looking economy meant nobody questioned the Bolivar's historically fixed exchange rate of 4.30 to the dollar. But then, fewer dollars and a worse-looking economy meant markets now start to question whether these 4.30 bolivars are really worth a dollar. It was on Black Friday in 1983 that President Campins had to abandon this exchange rate. This meant that you now got fewer dollars for your bolivars, which also meant that importing stuff was more expensive. This feeds into the other loop, putting pressure on domestic prices to go up.
Right, so in other words, from the early 1980s onwards, all signs were on inflation, which means prices going up. And that's a bit similar like this situation right now. Why then did prices not go up in the 1980s? Well, basically, governments have the power of the state on their side, which can prohibit prices from rising to a certain degree. Now, obviously, such countermeasures don't work forever. For example, when he finds out that wasn't actually a cop. If your economy is maladjusted, at some point you have to adjust it.
So in the 1980s, government tried to stem these market forces by devaluing the bolivar as little as possible and by limiting how many dollars could be taken out of the economy with so-called capital controls. Additionally, Pérez's predecessors tried to deficit spend their way out of the trouble, going into debt and spending the foreign currencies in the reserves. So by the time Pérez assumed office, the problem was that the exchange rate was still too strong, debt had accumulated already, and foreign reserves were running low. That all against the background of an economy running according to an ISI model that with low oil prices was no longer viable. So Pérez had to do something. But his team and the IMF basically vastly overestimated how quickly markets can self-regulate. Running through the IMF textbook treatment, they privatized companies, removed price and capital controls, liberalized trade and cut subsidies. And all of that more or less in one single blow. One consequence of this thinking we already know: the Caracazo unrests and lootings and the killings of the army in the crackdown. Another one was that poverty shot up another extra 10% in '89, and releasing all that inflationary pressure led to 90% inflation during an entire year.
So the problem with ISI was that it was very inward oriented. Compare this to the economic policy of the Asian tigers like Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea and Taiwan. They too protected infant industries, but they looked outwards and told the guys in the protected industries,
look, you better get up to speed. We want you to export and compete with international industry. Their policy was eventually export-oriented, which at once solved two problems: getting international currencies because they sold something to the world, and being constrained by only being able to sell to the domestic market because they could sell to the entire world.
Consider the harbor of Barcelona.
Millions upon millions of goods from all over the world are traded in these thousands of containers. At the local market, you can buy anything. The challenge Venezuela faces in this world of commerce is just like that of the street vendor. What do you offer that people worldwide actually want?
The temptation for Venezuela, and particularly Venezuelan politicians, will always be to base the economy on just oil, because it's a very easy and very expensive product. But oil is just one product. If Venezuela wants to advance from a street vendor selling one product to a supermarket selling many things, it needs to diversify its exports without becoming addicted to oil.